Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Cognitive Science Show towards a metapsychology that is true to transformation. Transformation very broadly construed, but very correctly construed to be reaching into primitive learning machinery up until today, and especially we're going to talk about issues of self-transcendence, the spiritual and religious dimensions of human development. And so once again, I'm joined by my friends and just Socratic companions, Zachary Stein and Greg Enriquez. And I'll let them again introduce themselves briefly. I'll set up the bridging platform from the previous episode. Zach will take the lead for a while, and then we'll shift into something perhaps a little bit more dialogical in nature. So first, if you guys could just reintroduce yourself.
Hey, Greg Enriquez, Cognitive Science Show probably knows me by now, so I'll just say that.
Yeah, Zach Stein, and happy to be here, developmental psychologist and other things.
So we've been tracing out and very carefully, and I'm not going to redo the whole argument because it's become quite complex without, I think, becoming unclear. I think the complexity has added to clarity rather than detracting from it. So what I'll just do is summarize where we're getting to. We ended the last episode with talking about sort of two or three things that were in deep relation. One was the importance of the imaginal aspect of human cognition and behavior for development. This is connected to serious play and a lot of the issues that Zach was talking about in the time. And I won't go over it again, but the role of that kind of behavior within the Piagetian framework and how profound it gets was talked about. Many other things were talked about. That's not all that was going on in the previous episode, but we were centering on that point towards the end, and we brought up the issue about religion as imaginal serious play that can afford development. And then this brought up the possibility, well, we can get sort of imaginally augmented real pattern detection, and you could see religion at its best helping people to do this, the mythological, the imaginal, and therefore being a way in which adults can go through serious play and significant development. But, and Zach brought up also the very real and corresponding danger via like Baudrillard, that what we might be trapped within is, the imaginal can become a self-enclosed simulation, a hyper reality that actually disconnects us from reality in an important way. And that, of course, brought up for me the important notion of religio, which, of course, might be one of the etymological words for religion. It has to do with connectedness. Some of you know the work I've done on relevance realization, connectedness, meaning in life. And I wanted to understand the relationship between human capacity for reflection on how the imaginal was being used, connections between reflection, religio, and wisdom. And then that immediately brought up connections to what I hope will be the main part of our discussion today, which is the dimensions that Zach has highlighted in his work of development that have to do around ensoulment and spirit and self-transcendence. And there's going to be discussion about that, so I'm not going to try and foreclose on what that means. That's precisely what we are going to try and explore together. So first of all, gentlemen, is that a fair enough sort of where the platform problem is for us?
Yeah, well, go ahead.
Great, excellent.
Yeah, I like that framing.
Great. So, and as promised, I was going to ask Zach, to take the lead on this and start perhaps, what's the religio, reflection, wisdom, and then how does that require us? I think, because I think it does, but maybe you disagree. How does it require? Does it require springing in these deeper dimensions of development that we're pointing at with these ancient notions of soul and spirit?
Yeah, totally. It's a wonderful platform for what I want to discuss. So, as I discussed in the prior ones, I'm a developmental psychologist, and I did a lot of work in cognitive development, Piaget and all of that whole tradition. But I also looked at everything that had been done in development, and some of that wasn't about cognition. Some of that was about things like emotional development and ego development, and the development of meditative capacity, right? The development of the ability to participate in certain religious rituals and be kind of anointed as having reached a certain capacity of religious initiation or something like that. So this is across all these developmental models, aided by people like Wilber and others. And what it became very clear was that they're not all comparable. Like cognitive development, and specifically the people who proceed along a very advanced line of cognitive development are different from, for example, people who are extremely mature and have extremely sophisticated character structures. Right. And so this is a common problem in the literature, and also one of the obvious critiques of the cognitive developmental tradition, which is that, well, really smart people, cognitively advanced people, abstract and complex, linguistically, mathematically sophisticated people can be naive and immature and socially inept, or worse.
Sometimes you refer to that as cognitive as skill development in some ways, or
Precisely.
I think that's a useful word to tie to that for people to track what your meaning is there. So I just throw that out there to
Yeah, I
folks.
mean,
I'm not sure if they know, or cognitive is a pretty loose word potentially. So I just, cognitive skill is a nice area.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, you're right. Cognition can be defined as broadly as basically psyche. Like some people make cognition and mind coterminous. I'm actually making cognition in a strict sense has to do with operations concerning, space and time, and things of that nature. Baldwin, who I've mentioned before, made a distinction between three major domains of development as a child grows. One has to do with concern with the objective world. This is the classic Piagetian stages of understanding causality and things of that nature. There's another dimension of development that has to do with the interpersonal world, specifically mom first, right? Specifically attachment patterns and things of that nature. And then there's another developmental trajectory that has to do with relation to yourself.
Beautiful.
So I, we, it, developing asynchronously. And so this is my point so I'm defining cognition as those elements of psychological process that have to do with orienting the nervous system, the body, and the mind to the existence of space and time and physics and those realities.
Right.
And you can develop quite far along those capacities and not have as rich an experience in the social world in its many dimensions of obligation and commitment and value and things of that nature to become what I would call mature. So, and then self-reference, self-reflection, meditation, awareness, emotional self-regulation, emotional self-awareness, relation development in the I, which often feels more like wisdom than maturity.
Well, I was going to say that because those dimensions, I tend to take a very broad notion of cognition because I relate it to knowing. That was the original meaning, and turns out all of these are ways of knowing, I would argue, but that's something we could talk about another time.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. And I think, so if we broaden knowing to mean what I call the four kinds of knowing, that's how I understand cognition. But I don't think that's an important point here. The point I wanted to make was that, something analogous or perhaps isomorphic goes on in the wisdom literature, properly called the psychology and cognitive science and neuroscience of wisdom, typified, for example, by the work of Monica Ardelt and others. We did this, Monica was part of the wisdom consensus paper, where you talk about, the cognitive dimension of wisdom, which has to do with understanding. She uses Keek's distinction between, descriptive knowledge, descriptive explanatory knowledge, and interpretive. And when we're talking about wisdom, we're talking about that interpretive function. That's the cognitive function. An affective dimension, which, as you mentioned, it has to do with attachment issues. And then a reflective dimension, which has to do with this meta-perspectival ability. And that wisdom has to involve I would argue, I don't know if Monica would be happy with this language, but I would say they have to form a well-functioning, self-organizing dynamical system in order to qualify wisdom. All of that is a way of saying that I think the wisdom literature, for whatever reason, I think it is independent, although some of these people have been influenced by the same influences as you, Zach. So I don't know what the degree of convergence is, but anyways, there's consilience between sort of the standard dimensionality that's coming out in the wisdom literature and what you're putting your finger on here. I think it can be.
Those three that I identify in the metapsychology as development, ensoulment, transcendence, I see them everywhere. That's why I like them as categories. They work
Right.
a lot of contexts. And then again, back to Baldwin's, it, we, and I being those basic dimensions. And then for transformation, you get something like skill development, something like personality development, which I call ensoulment because I'm in the tradition of that's dealing with it that way. And then you get something like consciousness development or development of awareness or reflection, which is what is actually kind of measured or assessed in those meditative traditions that have thresholds of capacity from which you can bestow teaching. Right. So
see there, I wouldn't say consciousness, precisely because of all the work, for example, Greg and I've done on Untangling the World Knot. I think this idea of meta-perspectival ability is right. So mindfulness is clearly meta-perspectival. It's the ability to take a perspective on your perspective forming abilities. It's classically meta-perspectival. And when we're talking about any kind of metacognition, we're invoking a meta-perspectival element. Again, this is just being a little bit maybe even nitpicky about terms, but that's what I mean when I think when I say why I think that dimension particularly lines up with what you're sort of that reflective self-understanding, if I'm understanding you correctly.
No, I think you are. And I think about it with what are you operating on in those three domains? In the domain of skill, it's kind of language and certain kinds of capacity and facility with the world. In the domain of ensoulment, you're actually operating with image and imagination and relationship. And in this domain of transcendence, I place that you're actually operating on consciousness itself. So you're working with awareness. And so that's why I labeled it as consciousness, because in those ones, consciousness is present, and that you're using consciousness, the grasp of consciousness works with language and with other people and those things. But in this domain, you're with consciousness itself and operating on consciousness with consciousness. And what gets interesting is that's actually the root of things like emotional self-awareness and emotional self-regulation, which I place in that domain. And that's where you can get, again, what alerted me to this was that I was encountering people who I understood as having undergone a lot of transformation in the sense that we're talking about, like these people changed over time. But some of them were really smart and had never meditated a day in their life and were very disorganized, and you could tell. And then other people were really, really mature, but not super intelligent in a classical sense, and had no spiritual practice. And then I met other people who were advanced meditators, and you could tell just by their capacity being with them, but they were not actually that mature or sophisticated cognitively. And so it's like, these are actually distinct. And so I started to see that these were relatively asynchronous forms of development that people could move in, and some different fields of developmental psychology or just psychology looked at them, and what I call ensoulment, broadly speaking, the depth psychological field. I'm focusing mostly on the Jungian tradition because it's the one that I spent the most time in, but it includes the work of Freud and others, and specifically Harry Stack Sullivan, who I think is maybe one of the most important figures in that area of thinking about the way personality structures accrue over time in relationship to need satisfaction possibilities in the social field, and those complexify over time, which is so different from trying to figure out how to circumnavigate the physical world, and so different from so I started to see these cleavings in this field of studying transformation and realizing that there were ways of doing assessment, ways of thinking about how the transformation worked. Like Piagetian stage theory works in narrow domains of what I'm calling cognitive development. It does not work in the domains of personality and character development and emotional development. It just simply doesn't. And those two never touch things that happen in meditative attainment and meditative transformation. So this is a strong claim. And I'm saying it's part of the cleavings and confusions in psychology and in these fields that deal with transformation is that they're mixing apples and oranges, and they don't kind of realize it.
So
are there bridging? Sorry,
Yeah.
I let you go to. So what I mean is,
There are. They're all related ultimately.
Right.
Yeah.
So, for example, like you can see that there's a meta trait of pursuing self-correction in each one of these,
Yes.
right? And then I think I'll turn it over to Greg in a sec, because I'm wondering where I see virtue as something that is trying to coordinate the development of these three, so they are mutually affording, and that brings up character, and that brings up one of Greg's critiques of, and then I like Greg talk, of standard way, like we're using the term personality here, and I hear you saying something other than how that is standardly used in psychology. And Greg has done a lot about, the way standard personality theory, big five theory, is deficient because it leaves out character as an important variable. So again, this makes me think of wisdom and virtue and character, and those are deeply interpenetrating ideas as being a meta trait. I don't want to call it a trait's not quite the right word, but you know what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to get at a meta factor that is specifically directed to the problem of properly aligning mutual affordance and development between them.
Yes.
Greg. So Greg, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was gonna allude to that, but I can weave that in absolutely. So the thing here's what I was going, which I think is complementary. But when we were mapping the self, we talked about sort of the experiential consciousness system, and then the first thing that it starts to do is it models the simulation of the paths of the self down various possible environmental agent arena relations. And really that creates then the first model of the self, which is an agent arena relationship across time. And that's going to set the stage for sort of an instrumental control relationship, because it's not very social. Then we added a social self other grounded in attachment. And I heard you say, first with the mother or with the caretaker. And then that, to me, then that's going to ground ensoulment and character, ultimately, the core sense of self in relationship to other, the image and affect constellation of what I would call character formation and character functioning, what we deal with in psychotherapy. And then finally, I just was finished reading Toward a Greater Psychology on Surya Urbandu's work as a yogi.
Beautiful.
Right? And basically that's dropping into consciousness, what I'd call mind two, and getting perspective on the ego and affording the capacity to transcend the local perspective and expand that structure into afford a wise meta perspective on the world in relation, and expand consciousness beyond the self in a particular kind of way. I see those lines as lining up pretty close to what I'm hearing in your framework.
Yeah, no, and that's not a coincidence. I mean, I'm very glad you brought Aurobindo in. One is hesitant to bring in the great Indian mystic and sage and freedom fighter, and prolific, nominated for the Nobel Prize by Aldous Huxley. And his work influenced me greatly, especially in that domain of transcendence, because he actually lays out, as Hinduism does and other meditative traditions do, these developmental transformations of consciousness dealings with itself, if I can put it that way. So it's the hierarchies of meditative attainments and higher states of transpersonal consciousness, which I class in this domain of transcendence, which are actually not super unusual experiences. They're just not named in our culture very well.
Right. Exactly.
And this is one of the things that Aurobindo does really well, because he was trained in England and was reading the Odyssey and the Greeks, and so he's merging part of the Bengal Renaissance, which is an amazing occurrence. He's merging the Western and the Eastern very well. So he's a really good source to plug in for the kind of thinking I'm doing in the metapsychology. And
let me offer a quick comment, because it's interesting, grounded as I am in naturalistic scientific psychology and even in unified theory. But 10 years ago, I got that book, A Greater Psychology, on his work, got into about 30 pages, like, this is way too out there. I just reread it 2 weeks ago. It's like, oh my God. Oh, I can follow the whole track through wisdom energy, the expansion into overmind. I have a whole iconic sun god that is the divine that shines back on me. See the dissolution of the ego. I mean,
Your system
like,
is actually
really,
your system's very Aurobindian. And
yeah, it's
Aurobindo
really
sometimes described as having the most comprehensive system since Plotinus in terms of this full stack, great chain being kind of model. But he has the evolutionary, just like you do, Greg, with the key points, and he sees those nodal points going back to the Hindu.
I was amazed. It's really is amazing. And he goes capital L life, capital M mind, into matter. I mean, it's like, what the it was really beautiful.
Aurobindo is no joke. And it's very interesting. And he himself, of course, was a serious mystic. So he has these first personal experiences that he's giving account of, both of the imaginal, like you're describing, John, with the overlay. And this, so a rewind. So that's what I was noticing about character structure, was that the people I encountered and the material I was reading about character structure, it became clear that what the person does who is mature is actually overlays the world with the power of their imagination. Right? Like they actually, and that's like you feel a sense when you're with a very mature person of their ability to create rituals spontaneously, just by virtue of having, because they're such a, like they're in, they are expressing something, a potential of personality, which is aspirational for everyone in their presence. And so that this makes possible creation of a context. And then the manner in which they carry themselves, the manner in which they make sense of the properties of their own mind and their own imagination and these kinds of things. And so Aurobindo had, in his own experience, in his own practice as a spiritual teacher. I mean, he created an ashram, and a whole city, Auroville, was created by the Indian government to honor him. You know, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but for a long time on Indian national TV, it was Gandhi and then Aurobindo, and then we moved on. So, these aren't the mystical rantings of some person who was not taken to, like, this is a profoundly transformative experiences in his life. Would be almost impossible to explain without expanding psychology beyond the dimensions of the West.
So can we zero in on that connection right there? Because we're all resonating on it. I can feel it. And for me, that's a place in which, let me call it the Baudrillard problem, is coming to the fore. And here's how I want to phrase the question problem. It seems like and I want to use this term and pick up on both meanings of it, given what I said a few minutes ago. It seems like we're properly talking for what you're calling the ensoulment dimension, if that's fair, Zach. We're talking about a virtuosity, both senses of the word, of the imaginal. And I want to know, what does that look like functionally and phenomenologically? Because that's the key of, the distinction between imaginally augmented reality detection. And that's what you're talking about with overlaying the imaginal. That's exactly what augmented reality is. That's what we do, like in heads-up displays and things like that, right? And the Baudrillard, no, this is self-enclosed simulation that, that is we're seeing is increasingly dangerous in our world today. And so in both senses of the word, there must be some virtuosity to the imaginal, and we need to not talk about that abstractly, but concretely, specifically, and practically, in the sense of how is it practiced? How is it developed? How do people acquire or cultivate virtuosity in the imaginal? And then if we get an answer to that question, I think that will help me more deeply understand what you mean by the ensoulment. I mean, I've done a lot of work. I've gone through Jungian therapy. I've done a lot of workshops. I've done IFS. I've read a lot of Raff's work and other people. And so this is like, I'm not unfamiliar with this. And so I want to, and part of the issue I've always had with many very good presentations of the Jungian is, I don't know, there's no, I want to be careful and respectful, but there isn't a clear stepping back and justifying the methodology in terms of a clear theory of the phenomenology and functionality of the virtuosity of the imaginal. That's why I find Corbin's work, for example, much more relevant on exactly that issue. So does that make sense of what I'm trying to, like that for me, this is a knife edge issue. Sorry, that sounds threatening. I didn't mean it to. But what I mean is that, like,
The soul's on the knife edge, Zach.
well, playing with the etymology, this is a decisive issue for me then. How about if I put it that way, right?
Do you want to go, Greg? Or I can go.
Well, I mean, so one thing, I mean, I've listened to Zach's presentation. So one way I'll just say here, and then Zach, you can pick up on this. If we say one thing I want to be clear about, the ensoulment versus sort of transcendent views are as different as I am steeped in psychotherapy, which I think Zach connects then to ensoulment. So when I connect with somebody, I'm tracking their image-based affect, self-other attachment structures down through their shadow and what kind of neurotic entanglements they have and what is their fundamental character formulation. As a psychotherapist, I'm trained into exploring that. I read Arabundu's work 10 years ago. I'm like, this is bullshit. I don't know what he's talking about here. Okay. In other words, I am underdeveloped at the transcendent mindfulness kind of dimension, or at least I don't have access to that in the same way I have access to ensoulment. So at least as I hear Zach's lines, I can then clearly differentiate. Actually, my entire training in psychotherapy has oriented me to particular character formation and development around the socio-emotional self-other modeling that affords capacity in relation that is deep, rich, or identifies when it's maladaptive, immature, and neurotic. And that's one level of development. But in relationship to being itself, in relationship to the potential symbols of eternity, in relationship to the expansiveness of transcendent consciousness, well, that's yogi psychology, which I now deeply appreciate, but I was not in any real position to do so based on my standard psychotherapeutic training. So I'd offer that as sort of just to make sure we're in the same sort of thread of domain. And maybe Zach, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the way I've heard you describe it and internalized it, at least in my own.
Well, maybe I could reply to that, and then that would help Zach.
Please.
I'm not denying any of that, Greg.
Okay.
Right.
Mhm.
But what I'm saying is there's another dimensionality. That's why I mentioned Corbin.
Gotcha.
The discussion of the nature of the Corbin or Ibn Arabi, right, where there's these Chadwick, there's these deep discussions. Hillman, other there's deep discussions of the imaginal, Raff, right, as if you don't want to call it, I would call it cognitive machine because it's a way of knowing, right? It's a profound, it's one of the lost ways of knowing, to quote Lachman. And so I'm interested in that. That's what I was trying to get at with the phenomenology and the functionality. Gotcha. I want to understand, right, what that development looks like around the, but Greg, I'm not saying I want to leave out the connection to, the Jungian, the psychodynamic. I want to see how they're properly connected together. That's the question I'm asking. Is that fair? Does that feel fair to you?
Yeah. No, I was just more clarifying my interpretation of the distinct lines of development that Zach has laid out. Right. And then, yes, as we dive into that, then identifying the developmental structures and cognitive machinery and all of that would afford that development is key. And yes, I think there's a lot to be said about that, but I just wanted to make sure we were in the space of lines of clarity.
Well, because I think, this has come up, I think there's deep connections between the imaginal as distinct from the imaginary, serious play and development. And we've already laid those connections, and I want to try and bridge them into this. Sorry, Zach, we're laying a lot at your foot, at your feet. I didn't mean to, but I want this question, good problem formulation, right? Before you try to solve it, make sure you've got really good problem formulation.
Totally.
Good.
No, so this is great. So the place I plug in directly to this is Hillman, James Hillman.
Right. Yeah.
Basically, as kind of a master for a couple of years, just reading. And so there's a couple of distinctions that help get some clarity here. And this is also a place where I got the form of soul spirit distinction or transcendence and soulment distinction. Right. I got it from Hillman, his book on the difference between soul, his essay on the difference between soul and spirit is key. So a couple terms, right? Imaginary, imagination, imaginal.
Yep.
And then you've got symbol, image, archetype, right? And archetypal, actually. If we can clarify those, we actually do a lot. So imaginary, I think, is where we get the Baudrillardian, worst of the Baudrillardian. Where this is just imaginary in the sense of like made up, just not real, no connection to reality. Imagination is, I take it as like a verb. Like imagination is the power to work with either imaginary or the imaginal, right?
Yeah. That's a problem with the term, though. The term is actually deeply equivocal. And so we have to be really, really careful when we're using it.
Exactly.
Yeah, good.
And so when I say like that the domain of ensoulment has to do with imagination and image and the imaginal, I'm not talking about the imaginary, but I am talking about the ability of the human to work with images and to constructively work with images and also to receive images. And this is where we get to the imaginal. And this is why when you're looking at the kind of virtuosity in the ability to imaginally detect through imaginal projection, detect real pattern.
Exactly. Well said. That's exactly.
So it's a virtuosity through imaginal projection of detecting real patterns. And one way to think about what happens here is just to take from the philosophy of science. Like if you don't have a naive philosophy of science and you do like a model-based science, right? Then your ability to run a fictional model helps you to frame patterns in reality you wouldn't otherwise see that are framed by the fictional model.
The work I've just published with Dan, and I mentioned that, I think, about the scientists working through the rovers on Mars and how they do all this imaginal work. They take these flat black and white pictures and they put color on it and they do this stuff and then they enact, I'm the rover now, and they identify with the rover and they do all this imaginal stuff because they look through that imaginal augmentation and that allows them to actually track the phenomena on Mars that they're trying to study. They can't do the field work without that imaginal behavior.
And so what you realize when you start to work with imagination and specifically with received image, so this is dream work, right? So you have a dream. It is a product of your imagination, yes and no, right? But it does produce an image or a series of images which you can actively work on with your imagination. And so what becomes interesting here, as I mentioned, was symbol and archetype and archetypal. And so one of the key distinctions I make in Jungian analysis is between the ensoulment work and the transcendence work, and they're doing both and they're confused. Ensoulment work is about working on image and going into the uniqueness of the image and into the particularities of that image that have to do with you and you alone and your relationships and only your relationships. Working with symbol has to do with actually extracting from the unique, the universal property, right? So if I have a dream and I'm in my boyhood room and there's a crucifix on the wall and I'm on my knees, right? And I know my mom's coming up the stairs, right? That's a potent image. Now it includes my mom, my room, right? My house that I grew up in. And I can work with the image in my imagination, keeping it in the domain of the archetypal. It's an archetypal image, right? But I don't have to extract the universal symbols of the cross, the mother, the kneeling, right? Those are symbol. And so those are different and they afford different kind of therapeutic relief. Like fleeing the uniqueness of my personality towards the universality of the experience I'm having is very helpful. But there's also something about diving down and into the particularities. And this is where the psychotherapeutic is different from, let's call it spiritual teaching, where the psychotherapeutic is resolving the shit with your mom, not with everyone's mom in general, with your mom, right? In that bedroom.
That's right.
And so that's ensoulment. Ensoulment isn't about the universal self, capital S. Ensoulment's about unique self. And unique self is not the symbol that stands for everyone. It's Zach and exactness, and it's dealing with the finiteness and tragic structure of everyone's actual unique story. Tragic in the most beautiful sense, in the ancient sense, of everyone's story. And that's a very rich form of therapy, but it doesn't discount the forms of therapy that bring you up and out of your unique story into a universal reflective space of symbol, consciousness, and unity with all things, which is where Aurobindo takes people. Although he gets you back to the unique self, he takes you up and out of your little story and into this massive cosmic story that you're a part of. And into the transcendent and into how every aspect of your life is actually a symbol of something universal, which is another form of imaginal overlay, but has transcendent dimensions to it.
So when I'm doing, so
Go ahead.
oh, go ahead. So just so give you an example about just when I'm doing psychotherapy, the lens that I use for what I call the heart relationship system is the influence matrix. And what it basically does is it identifies the self-other matrix on key process dimensions, meaning the patterns by which self-other exchanges have unfolded and their meaning on issues of power, love, freedom, and ultimately a sense of relational value and social influence. And then these get emotionally charged in our important relationships and their fundamental meaning.
Right.
And then they sit in individuals' developmental psyche, the triumphs and the tragedies and the traumas in relationship to that. And a huge amount of the work then is to metabolize that for them in terms of the unique image affective meaning constellations that then what the fuck does this mean about me and who I was and who they were in this world. And so that's
precisely, yeah. And then the image of the self that you receive from that past of history is the image that you hold of yourself. So exactly. Doing imaginal work in the domain of ensoulment is about working with the unique image of self that has been like accumulated to you through all of those pasts. So yeah, that's totally. Very specific, sacred autobiographical.
And one of the things we try to do is do all sorts of mentalizing. So mentalizing would be imaginal work in relation to what is mom's thoughts, or can you even go back to yourself, your childhood self, and relate to your childhood self in a different kind of parenting than maybe you received, or the way in which your internalized introject critic has parented you in the past, and cultivate a different kind of imaginal relationship with that space.
So that was very helpful, Greg. That was very helpful. Thank you. What I heard, and you already invoked it, Zach, I hear Wilber's, the pre-trans fallacy issue. And so pre being that we confuse pre-egoic stuff with trans-egoic stuff, and maybe Jung didn't adequately distinguish between those. Whether or not that's correct exegesis of Jung, I'll put aside. I think the distinction is independently valuable. And so here's I think it's non-controversial, perhaps that's controversial for me to say, but meta-controversial, that, the spiritual dimension has always been associated with this kind of meta perspective. The word transcendence means it, going up and above this, that somehow alleviates you or ameliorates egocentrism, right? This is one of the markers of maturity that isn't adequately captured in some of the more cognitive models. The decentering, etc. These are typical, but the issue I then had, sorry, I hope this works, and I'm not trying to accuse anybody, but the language both of you were using for describing ensoulment was very egocentric, right? Me, Zachness, right? And so I hear also, and is this the pre-trans fallacy? That's why I introduced it. I hear Jung, for example, classically saying, no, in the end, this ensoulment move is not egocentric because the ego is coming into relationship, and this is Atman, right? The ego is coming into relationship in its depths of something that is, properly, not egoic in nature, but to whom the ego has to understand itself in a grounding relationship. So there's a ground, or Washburn talks about the dynamic ground, right? And so do you see what I'm trying to get at? How, there seems to be both of these dimensions are, if you'll allow me this, are going trans-egoic in some more neutral sense. And yet, how do we preserve, what's the difference here? And how does the ensoulment get beyond egocentrism? Is that a fair question to ask?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect question. In my model, all three domains go beyond the personal at their highest reaches, right? So especially when you get into the advanced sciences, there is a form of egolessness that's necessary to do the thinking in the domain of development, basically, in the domain of skill development. And similarly, the selflessness that arises as a result of transcendence is kind of well known as your classical kind of Eastern Enlightenment version of trans-egoic awareness and capacity. It's mostly handled in what I call the transcendent. What's interesting is that psychotherapy in the West put a cap on personality development. And so there's this problem with ego and personality, right?
Yeah,
And the personal, that's another set of terms: ego, personality, personal.
Zach, Zach, we talked also about, personality and personhood as a little bit different.
Yes, exactly. And so that's even more useful. So there's a form of personhood that transcends the egoic.
Yep.
There's a form of personhood and a form, I think, of personality that transcends the merely personal. And so these would be the dimensions of ensoulment that lead you through your personal story into a deeper story that's about more than you, as opposed to negating your personal story as if it's an illusion and doesn't matter. Which is where the transcendent bias occurs in a lot of the people who simply talk about the transpersonal as if the person is an illusion. Personhood is not an illusion. And this is the most dangerous thing that is occurring in the merger between capitalism and Eastern Enlightenment traditions, is the elimination of personhood through a transcendent bias for understanding the transpersonal and the non-egoic. And it's frightening because it's first of all, it's incorrect, but it lays the groundwork for a quite a slippery slope, especially if you wet it with certain forms of postmodernism. So it's very important for me, actually, in the ensoulment dimension, to land that notion of what Gaffney calls the unique self, which is a form of personhood beyond the egoic and a form of personality beyond the merely personal. There's another sense of ego, which is just the capacity for the psyche to organize itself. So that's a functional definition, which also is maintained in those two domains and which can be dysregulated by a transcendent bias. This is another thing I encountered in meditators was in fact.
You put your finger on the whole, both individual and collective spiritual bypassing problem, which has also become very prevalent today. And I think that's important. And I'm glad to hear that being brought in critically. And the whole mindfulness, thing is all about spiritual bypassing.
But I also mentioned that the psychotherapeutic community keeps ensoulment at the personal, so it just becomes like endless shadow work from which you.
Well, that's what I wanted to point out.
Totally,
exactly. That what you've got is this brings back the virtue notion again. Each one, if these are improperly related, you get biases in both direction, right? You get the spiritual creating a spiritual bypass bias, and you can get the therapeutic. Creating this egocentric bias, the perpetual neurosis kind of culture that we can cultivate. And so, again, I think the relationship between these two dimensions, which is I keep hammering on.
I want to return to that because you mentioned that I never got to it, which was one of the goals of the metapsychology, was to look for the meta factors across.
Exactly. That's exactly. So
I have a lot to say about that, but Greg.
Well, just a really quick point, John, to connect to the ensoulment issue. One of the things that you have spoken to, which really speaks to my work in psychotherapy, is from a cognitive recursive relevance realization, the reciprocal narrowing and self-absorption that the neurotic structure gets at. Like when you feel defensive, all of a sudden the fear for self becomes pervasive and it becomes reciprocally narrowing, and you then act in ways you project and then act, and often creates the vicious cycle. Okay. So what do we try to do? We create mentalizing. And what ideally we would also try to do is create the capacity to connect with people to afford mutual reciprocal opening, i.e. either romantic love or agape, and then the capacity to hold that agapic kind of position that affords reciprocal opening amongst a network of relational souls, as it were, would then be a maturation beyond the self, but maintaining in the in the ensoulment structure.
That's good. That's good. So I'm hearing that, and I like what Greg just did, right? So because we fall into these Cartesian metaphors that are, so ensoulment is not necessarily inner, even though it has to deal with, right? So it can very much be, are we reciprocally narrowing or reciprocally opening? And although it is self-relevant, it is not self-centered ultimately. Or, we can play with what we mean by self. It's not bad that ultimately you're getting to. How I'm using the term ego is not just that function, the self-organizing function, right, of the psyche. I'm using it more specifically right? When people talk about it in ego dissolution, the autobiographical self that claims to be the sole metaphysical locus of agency, which is, and that claim is undermined in flow states, it's undermined in mystical states, etc. That's what I'm talking about. And so there's a way of, if agency is a proper part of personhood, and reflective appropriation of agency is a proper part of personhood, which I would say it is, then we can get into states in which we are developing personhood that are not egocentric. They are actually shutting off that narrative autobiography so that we can get to depths. And that's what I was trying to point at. But then what we're getting into is there seems to be some dialogical relationship between ensoulment and self-transcendence or transcendence.
Yes.
That and I want, like, that's what I want to keep coming back to. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be.
No, that's where I want to go.
Yeah. Because that to me is the metapsychology. That's where it can talk to us the most.
Yeah, and so it's between transcendence and ensoulment and what I'm calling development or skill development.
I mean all of them. I mean all three, because we've just been focusing on these right now because we're trying to get. But and that's what I was trying to get. Because virtue has an aspect, power. It has an aspect of skill to it. It has an aspect of character to it, but it has an aspect of aspiration to the divine in it. So the term virtue, if we properly unpack its history and its etymology, is designed to try and talk about the proper alignment of those three dimensions in development. At least I would argue that.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to define virtue. I mean, it's just interesting because all three of them require one another to actually work. And that's the problem with having a bias in either one, is that it's a performative contradiction, because you actually need the others to do that thing you're doing in any one of them.
Exactly.
So like this is the mistake, classic mistake in education theory, which is to teach the kid math without giving him a good reason about, when specifically an emotionally motivating reason that attaches to his image of himself. And then once the math is learned, you don't give him a thing to do with it that actually makes the skill more than what it is, like the transcendent dimension. So if you just really simplify it, you think about the relation between them. If you want to do anything, if you want to change your image of yourself, you have to develop new skills, and you have to get new new consciousness. And if you want to develop a skill, you have to imagine yourself as the person who wants that skill, which is to say, you have to attach, learning to personhood, and you have to attach them both to consciousness. And that was incidentally, this was Piaget's notion of the grasp of consciousness. It was that thing that consolidates learning, that brings it into the total psyche, and it becomes conscious, basically.
I have a concrete example of that. I was tutoring somebody. This has happened more than once. Tutoring people in math, and why am I doing this? Because they weren't getting an answer, or they get a market-oriented answer, because you'll need to calculate your profit at some point. It's like, you only need arithmetic for that. Like, why do we need arithmetic? Is calculation, but we ultimately want people to be able to prove things. Math is about proof. Arithmetic is about calculation. I mean proof in the technical sense, not in the epistemological sense, right? And I was saying, well, try this. Then I said, notice how your mind feels when you're doing math. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, for me, I get this kind of open, I get this clearness and this right. And I started to describe imaginally, right, the phenomenological feel, right, of math. And they went, oh, and then I said, again, imagine being able to do that more often in other domains, right? I was basically doing Spinoza, right? And they went, oh, and then that was like, oh, right, this, and then all of a sudden, oh, well, I want to do this more, because they saw, right, they tasted the developmental potential. But that's why I keep coming back to, what's the phenomenological functional features of this virtuosity, so that because that's what teacherly authority education, so that we can seriously recommend it to other people.
Interesting. Right. I mean, again, to return to the simplicity of it, like the classic example of the elder facilitating an imaginal recognition of real pattern.
Yes.
Right? is storytelling.
Yes. Yes.
Storytelling. And so there's something basic about narrative structure and imitation that allow for those kinds of contexts to be created of teacherly authority, like you're describing. And teacherly authority in the domain of the imaginal is what it's what Greg's describing as his role as a therapist.
Yes.
Here's the way to mentalize your memories and to rethink your mother and to rethink that pain, right? So there's a type of very specific teacherly authority in the domain of ensoulment and the domain of transcendence, and you don't want to mix them up because it's actually a bad idea to give people advice to just simply transcend it. Like they also need to reimagine.
Yeah, very much.
And so that there's some kind of species specific trait that allows us to, through vicarious empathetic kind of relationship, create imaginal containers in which other people can reimagine themselves, basically.
Yeah.
Totally. This is what your mom does for you when you're a kid. Some days you'll be X, Y, and Z. Right. And if she says something bad, that's not a good childhood.
Not her child.
If she says something, there's that sense of the ability to, like, the contagion of the imaginal overlay and frame, which, again, back to Baldwin, he was seeing that. He was seeing this, the mimesis, the mimicking. He plugged into Tarde, I think that's how you say it, or the French, who's the same guy that Girard plugs into. And so there's something deep in that domain of character in particular, of the imitative and the imaginal being
very much,
very, very close. And
they're very close. They have.
And so often the therapist will model, even in their gesture and tone of voice, emotional self-regulation. Like they will change their body, like those little, and this is, again, as I noted, with very mature people, they're holding themselves different. Like they literally raise the level of conversation by entering the room by virtue of the kinds of patterns of gesture that they have. And so the therapist aids in the empathetic reimagining of the self by showing what it's like to live in that imaginal space. Right. When you are imagining yourself as dignified and worthy of respect, you sit differently. Right. If you are dignified and worthy of respect and you sit that way, no one will disconfirm that. Right. If you're pretending to be dignified, if you're acting like an asshole and you try to sit that way, then slowly that image of self should change, unless you control your environment so well you never get the negative feedback. But,
so let me narrow in even more then, because we're getting, this is really good. So you did something that was really good. You said, but your mom can do it badly. There's a normativity here. Yes. Right? And that's what so what's the functionality and phenomenology that allows us to talk about, explicate the normativity? Because that's it, back to the original question, right? And we haven't wasted our time. We're doing the Socratic thing. We're taking it deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. It's like, how do I know when I'm doing this well, as opposed to when I'm doing it badly, and not just out there theoretically, but in here phenomenologically, functionally? This is analogous to questions I continually get asked when I'm teaching people meditation. How do I know when I'm doing it well? Right. And it can't just be that you're having bizarre, unusual experiences. That's useless. It's basically useless. It doesn't cleave apart, right? Normative development in the moral sense of normative, the aspirational sense, not statistical normative, the normative sense of development from the dysfunctional, or whatever we want to call it. So this is the question I keep coming back to. And this is the question I keep probing I sound obsessional, but I keep probing in Jung and Corbin and Ibn Arabi. It's like, yes, I get everything you're talking about. I'm talking about why these things are so important. Yes. But in the end, how do I practice this well? Right. In the end, I don't want to, in the end, not exclusively, but in the end, I don't want to know what to believe about this. I want to know how to practice it well. And that's why I brought up this idea of virtuosity. Again, like, that's what, sorry, but I keep on driving in this, because for me, religions had an answer to that. Right? And one of the things what we're facing is, and one of the things maybe a metapsychology can help afford us, is an answer to that question. because one of Greg's points is there is no unified normativity. Even for psychotherapy, I hear him saying everybody's got their different normativity all over the place. And so when you ask, is therapy going well? Depends on which therapeutic framework. It's going really well. No, this is a disaster, right? And so this is directly where I think the metapsychology comes into the center of what we're wrestling with here. But what are the, and this may be unfair to you, Zach, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you're also very brilliant and you're very sensitive. So, I want to try, and maybe we can all help, right? And Greg is here, and Greg is like a systematizer, right? So, you know what I'm asking. I'll stop.
Yeah. Well, how about I throw something out, and then as you metabolize that. So this might not go as deep, as you're really asking a question, but here's the basic framing in which I see. So in terms of pretty sort of recursive relevance realization mechanics, okay, the internal mapping of the structure of the self-other structure has capacities to pattern itself in a wide variety of different ways. The goal, the functional goal, in my estimation, was for the system to have a coherent, realistic integration around the experience of known and valued. Okay, so there's actual sort of an attachment structure that affords a particular way of being in the world that indicates good functional form. Right? And so it's got, and basically, and you can just see this in basic, are you securely attached or insecurely attached? Okay. And then there are processes by which then you want to consolidate the system towards that development. There'd be processes of, if you have past trauma, processes of metabolizing that trauma in particular ways that affords the signal of the trauma and the affect association to grant what does that signal mean to you, and then how do you metabolize it towards a particular growth orientation. And I mean that, sort of like that would afford coherent consolidation in relationship to a ground of being that is secure, oriented towards a sense of being known and valued, as opposed to a system that feels fragmented, broken, and defensive in relationship to an enormous number of dialectical processes that are pushing against it, okay, but can't possibly be integrated. So if you do internal family systems, each one of these is a mode that attacks the other side and has a dialectical structure that is defined against it in a particular kind of way. So one kind of mechanistic indicator of good functional form is the coherent integration of the self-other object system to afford a sense of positivity out of which growth can be achieved, as opposed to a defensive, rigid, fragmented structure that has an enormous amount of conflicting polarization in relationship to it.
That's very helpful, Greg. But here's how I want to respond to that. I would want to say that Plato basically says that's one half of how we get the normativity. There's that's the core argument of the Republic. There's the inner justice, but the inner justice has to be in conformity and resonate dynamically with the outer justice, right? We have to have an ontology that that does justice to reality, right? Oh. And so right.
So I was definitely, I'm inside the therapy room there with a psychological doctor lens. That's a N of one or a relational doctor of one, not inside the society that forms a social ontology that either affords that or not.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you. So you're acknowledging, and I would go beyond the social environment. There's ultimately a relationship to reality, to per se, the really real. Right, and I think that the spiritual has something to do with that. We make it bring it in. So I'm trying to So for me, I've been trying. I genuinely mean the question I just asked a few minutes ago. But I've been trying to use anagage and reciprocal opening and this kind of higher order dialogos between one's ontology and one's psychology. Really understanding psychology as the logos of the psyche. And that we seem to have these two meta drives, inner peace and being in touch with reality, and they have to mutually afford each other. And Plato's argument, and I want to know what you guys think of it, is that's the best we have. We don't have any higher kind of normativity by which we can discover if we're developing well or not. Now, I find that plausible, but I'm not like, oh, yes, no question, I'm done. The Socratic part of me still wants to ask, because we're here now, what's the normativity feel like in its phenomenological functional presence, and can that be justified as a normativity? Because if we can't do that, we're ultimately this is all. Sorry, and I don't mean this dismissively. Zach, you know I think your work's great. Greg, you already know that I love your work. I'm not doing that. I want to say that clearly.
But you're asking a really deep philosophical question.
No, it's a very question.
It's a very, very deep philosophical and a super important one. And we touched on it briefly. So you remember, like, if let's put transcendence and ensoulment aside and just talk about what I'm calling development, skill development, which was last night with huge idea levels.
Yes.
And that there were these feedback and that mechanisms between the sensory motor and the representational mind that allowed it to self-correct pretty spontaneously in relationship to reality, so that the reality dependence of the developmental transformations was clear and actually driving the transformation. And so that results in things like successfully walking, right? We don't make school curriculums for walking.
Yes.
You don't even really teach parents how to teach your kids to walk. I mean, maybe they do because it's an industry to sell books to moms, but you don't really need to know anything. The special, as an educator, your kid will learn to walk because it's in the process of development, which is still a reality dependent process of development, right? So that same analogy actually applies to the other two domains, that there are lower order structures in ensoulment. These sort of look like things like attachment. Which are so kind of demonstrably dysfunctional that it would be akin to the kid not being allowed. So this is actually a living experiment where there was a Chinese apartment building where there was only concrete, and so they didn't allow the kids to crawl because it hurt their hands and legs to crawl. And these kids were systematically kind of like developmentally stunted as a result of not being able to explore sensory motor space, basically. Right? So something like that can happen in attachment patterns, where there's basically and in those lower order levels where there's clear feedback between the system and reality. And so similarly with self-reflection, this occurs. And so that's one thing I'm positing, that there are mechanisms in place in those domains where we do have feedback with reality that's immediate and which phenomenologically fucking feels that way, and like when the child is with a mother and the mother is neglecting the child, the phenomenological experience of the child is that this is bad. Now eventually they'll try to get out of that and cover over neuroses and try to not feel as bad as they actually do, but it's there. And so similarly with the circumnavigation of space in the sensory motor realm. Now, here's what gets interesting. The phenomenology of mathematics, and you already mentioned the phenomenology of mathematics. What is the experience of knowing that the equation is correct?
Yes, exactly.
What is the experience of knowing the equation is correct? Like that, if we can figure out that phenomenology in a way that doesn't get us confused and postmodern, but actually gives us reality, then we can begin to work on the others, I would argue. And I think mathematics is pretty uncontroversially cognitively successful. And it's also the case that mathematicians know when something is correct and when it is incorrect. And they don't know that by virtue of doing experiments or statistics or anything like that. They're using their mind. Now, we could move that into AI systems, and people forget how to use their minds to verify mathematical truths, but we can use our minds to verify mathematical truths. I believe we can also use our minds to verify moral and ethical truths. Now, most of our ontologies that we've been inheriting from modernism tell us that that's not the case. Or Aurobindo would laugh at that. He would say it's obviously demonstrably the case that we know what's right and wrong.
So this is a classic Platonic argument. You can't come into the academy unless you can do math, right? And it's interesting, the math there is inherently geometry. So it's bridging between the spatial temporal domains and And then, of course, the same thing in Spinoza, right? And there's this idea that there's a fundamental connection between realness and intelligibility and the phenomenology and the functionality of math. It's not that everything has to be done math, like Descartes says. That's not what's going on in Spinoza. It's clearly not what's going on in Plato, because Plato never uses math except in the Meno and a couple. He's more about, no, again, how does your mind feel and function in this? And how does that give you an insight, a skill developing, a virtue developing insight into intelligibility, and then through intelligibility, because intelligibility and realness are like this, realness. Is it fair for me to make that connection?
Yes, that's the connection I'm trying to make. It's not that we need to think about those other domains like they're mathematics, not at all. But mathematics is like a really interesting example of a place where there's a phenomenological certainty that something is correct. And here's the other thing that gets interesting. I mentioned in the domain of ensoulment, the endogenously produced image and then also the received image, right?
Right.
In mathematics as well.
Yeah.
Many of the most advanced mathematicians who provide equations that are incredibly useful in engineering and concrete applications. So they're fucking about as real as anything that we can call real in our Western scientific society, occur in dreams, occur in fugues and states of
and insight, also insight,
and also just flashes of insight. And so this question of how do you know when something's real? In the domain of the ensoulment and in the domain of the imaginal, we also get into how do you know that the received image is significant, and the ability that the received image allows you to reformulate your endogenous image of yourself, which is the transformation of soul in the domain of ensoulment, the movement of the image, the transformation of the image of self. That gets super interesting. And so that's where the work of dream, and as I already mentioned, the work of allowing yourself to be in social relationships that can actually disconfirm your erroneous image of yourself, or confirm the accuracy and shed more light on who you actually are, which you're getting from your received images, from dreams or spontaneous imaginations about who you are, what you're capable of. And so that sense of part of the answer in all of these, I believe, is also a particular type of social situation that allows for that base stack of reality dependent development to continue up beyond where it's easily reality dependent. Right. So monasteries are an interesting example of this. It's really interesting to go on a meditation retreat and then come home, as opposed to just stay and not leave. And so under what conditions can one actually display certain capacities in a way that they could be disconfirmed? Right. So if one claims to have certain types of spiritual capacity, has one been put in a situation where that could actually be disconfirmed? Right. Similarly, if one believes that they're ethical in a certain way, or that they have a potency of archetypal personality, are they actually in situations where that could be disconfirmed, or have they created situations that systematically allow for it not to be disconfirmed? Right. So these are the kinds of things that led us to say that no, there are domains in these where if we set up the social situations right, that we know the same way you know that math equation, which no one has ever run before, you know it's correct anyway, even though no one's ever run it before. Similarly, in these domains, if the social situation is right and there is reality in the room, then you'll know. And I think that's the experience people have, especially when a bunch of mature people get together and there's an ethical situation that emerges. Right.
But that's the proper Socratic question. The proper Socratic function is exactly, this is what I'm trying to get at with dialogos, where we are set up to, we're trying to set up, right, discourse within distributed cognition, where people are not just communicating, but communing with each other, so they can do exactly that, attuning or misattuning with each other to try and do exactly what you're talking about. That is like, that's one of the design features of dialectic at the dialogos.
Yeah, so it's not an answer definitive, it's like a process.
Exactly.
A commitment to certain kinds of process. And the domains of ensoulment, what gets interesting is, it's not about what I'm saying and testing the cognitive truth of what I'm saying. It's about who I'm being and testing the worth and value and legitimacy of who I think I am. Right.
Exactly. People, what happens is people get a sense, right? They get a sense of the relationship but between, I'm trying to be, there's a deep connection between getting into right relationship with others, reciprocally opening, right? Or revealing of reciprocal narrowing, right? And getting into right relationship with the particular propositions, the theoretical, the topic, the topics that we always do dialectic and dialogos about are exactly virtue. The virtue topics, what is honesty? And what happens is people start, of course, definitionally, and you can see them doing the Socratic thing. They move away from the definition to, well, I don't really know, but I have a sense. And I got into this, I started to really understand what it might mean through the connections I was having to other people and what I didn't know. And like people move from possessing a proposition into, and I'm playing on this, obviously, into proposing a way of life. And that's a very different move.
Well, and then also beyond proposing a different way of life, claiming to be an exemplar of that way of life.
But
and
those for me, those are inseparable.
Inseparable. Okay, interesting. Yeah. So that means you need to be in a context that could disconfirm that. So that would be right. Yeah.
There has to be one where there are very almost measurable variable management of variables, because people can tell when you're being like, what you're doing is really heightening a flow state between individuals, a reflective flow state, such that people get very finely tuned at when people are checking in or checking out or being manipulative versus being participatory and open to transformation. So you get this distributed cognition machine, the spirit emerges that, right, it starts to govern and regulate. These are not the right terms, but they're close, right? How people are tuning and tracking and maintaining religio with each other on an ongoing basis.
So one of the things that that this get me thinking about, let's see, it's a slightly different angle, but it took me in the direction of sort of what I may call meta-normativity. And the hunt for, like, as I honed in on systems of justification as being these propositional networks that are coordinating and legitimizing is and ought, then the question emerges, well, are there meta-cultural systems of justification that transcend local emergent cultural contexts? And I think that the answer is, yeah, there really are at a pragmatic level. So for example, I then looked at, well, what are the kind of global systems when people get together and have to negotiate what they actually agree on, what emerges in relationship to that? And I argue that actually what ultimately sort of sits on my signature line is be that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity. And I arrived at those through an analysis of sort of global systems of justification, where the dignity is a reference to the core value that undergirds the United Declaration of Human Rights, where it's the most consensually agreed upon document across different cultures, whereby how do we confer justice in relation? How do we understand when you would be able to sit from an external cultural perspective and say, hey, that's not okay. What would possibly ground that? And the argument was actually, well, we don't agree why people have dignity, but if we confer dignity, then you can confer justice as a justification in relationship to action. And so dignity becomes, and that basically means the person has fundamental aesthetic value and respect. And you can then twist that in terms of fundamental, and then there's incremental in terms of, well, it's a dignified act or an undignified act. And then well-being at the World Health Organization, the commitment to, basically flourishing biologically, psychologically, and socially in relation, as opposed to dysfunction and distress across those different dimensions. And then ultimately science and other orientations towards honor, integrity, truth, and justice. And ultimately those do kind of translate into true goodness, beauty kinds of tripartite, but actually they do speak to a potential global meta-normativity that would be cross-cultural in some regards.
So one of the criticisms, this is very good work, Greg, and I think highly of it. One of the criticisms that has been made within postmodernism, the aspects of postmodernism that I take serious, is that's ultimately a form of humanism, and that it still locates value ultimately within human beings. And then the argument is that has been a framework that has contributed to our environmental crisis in a very significant way, because, right, we need to be, or the object-oriented ontologists say, we're making human beings half of all of ontology, and do they, like, what, and can we justify it? And so one of the issues would be, we don't have a similar document. We're trying to forge one right now with the IPCC about the environment, but we're having a devil of a time getting anything that isn't just murbly. I mean, we're getting lots of great science. And what I mean is we're getting lots of great science about, look at what's happening. But when we try to get like a philosophy of what we should do, it's seriously impoverished. It's
Very much so.
seriously impoverished. So do you understand that?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of this is situating at the expansion of a particular normativity that is located in human knowledge in a particular way.
Yeah.
And this relationship with other sentient beings, with the organization of the universe as a whole. I mean, I think those are, I can consider those to be, sort of open and unresolved questions in many regards.
But you consider them important too, though.
But absolutely,
right.
The expanse of the properness of the boundary and relation is a beautiful transcending question to reflect on. How to justify various lineages in relationship to that. I mean, I would say, in relationship to like human-centeredness, like people will accuse this of sort of, hey, that's a anthropomorphic and my response is, okay, you're driving down the road, right? And all of a sudden a little kid runs out from one way and a squirrel runs out from the other way. And it's like, if you choose this kid that you're going to run over, then there's a particular reaction in relation, right? They're certainly, so anyway, this whole issue of what is actually human exceptionalism and human ontonormativity versus other kinds of domains is a beautifully and brilliantly tricky question.
It is, and that's a well-posed thought experiment. Here's the other thought experiment on the other side. There's a child, and if you let the child die, you save the Amazon rainforest and renew it for 1,000 years.
Totally.
Now, when you ask people that question, they're like, "Oh, I don't know." And then you can even do this thought experiment. And 100 years from now, human beings are going to all be gone. So it's not how the human beings can use the rainforest, just the rainforest for itself. People still go, "Gee, I don't know." Right. And so what I'm saying, and I'm not saying we should kill the child. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm trying to get at that there does seem to be a growing sense, right, that while there is a sacredness to human life, right, it's not, I don't know, there might be some idolatry attached to that, if you can use a biblical religious language. And I don't know if that's even the right way to pose this. I'm really hesitant about this because I don't want to come off the wrong way, but I'm trying to get at something.
If we're committing to expansion across our ego, there is no other option but to drop into, trans alter humanistic positions, right? I mean, what does it mean to be what does it mean to be the squirrel? What does it mean to be the Amazon? What are the valuations across a wide variety of different domains? And you have to drop into those perspectives.
I mean, and one of the things that the mystical tradition makes clear is that ultimately, right, there is something more real, more valuable than us. I mean, in Platonic, there's the one, right?
There's the one,
right?
Totally.
And so, like, but on the other hand, like, that is never separated from, yes, but it has to mean that human beings are cultivating wisdom and virtue. I don't want to present them as oppositional, but I'm trying to get them, I'm asking the question about what's the right relationship and how do we respond to the postmodern critique that we're ultimately doing, a very complicated Renaissance humanism kind of thing. And that's been problematic.
I mean, I think the way to respond to the postmodern critique is to abandon modernity. Like, I'm in favor of what I would call a post-secular way of theorizing some of these planetary issues.
Yeah.
I don't think we can resolve the issue by saying, well, we don't know where human dignity comes from, but we're gonna respect it as an aesthetic value. Like, it's kind of bizarre given the prior justifications given by humanity for human dignity by the great religious traditions.
Exactly.
So it kind of seems like extremely actually immature, kind of childless and naive answer to the question of why is the human valuable? And I think the deep confusion around the place of the human in the web of life also has created a lot of confusion and nihilism.
Yep.
And so I
Yes.
think, we're going to be looking at, because of the nature of some of the planetary changes underway, a reemergence of religious solutions to the meta-normative planetary framework. And so this brings us directly back to Aurobindo, who said this, who, and the reason Huxley nominated him for the Nobel Prize, because Huxley was a perennialist, right? Perennial philosopher. And so the work that I'm doing with Gaffney and Wilbur is in that direction of a neo-perennial solution to this problem of a planetary meta-normative structure. Most of the world is still a member of one of these religious traditions, by the way, secular West. Vast majority of the billions upon billions of people are believing religious traditions. And so the idea that like we're going to resolve this in a humanist secular way is colonialist, frankly. Like, and I'm going to use that postmodern term to gain credence with the postmodernists, who I'm actually arguing against, by saying that though there is actually a very real universal reality that unites all of humanity, and it's spirit. And this is what Aurobindo would claim. And it's phenomenologically accessible if you move through the domains of ensoulment and transcendence, and don't just get so hung up on becoming smarter and smarter and smarter in domains of operational efficiency. And so it's the absence of synchronous ethical and spiritual development in our educational systems that makes it appear as if there is no moral universal, when it's just as tangible as these abstract math equations we're having kids do in the 12th grade. But we don't bring them up and into a moral consciousness or culture that makes it possible.
Right. And this is exactly what's emerged in the whole tree of knowledge. Like, so for example, you go back to sort of the energy real-ontic infinity at Big Bang, but really for me, the icon of the elephant sun god is the infinite imaginal of, positive wisdom potential. And that's as orienting and clear in, everyday coordinates as anything in relation. So for me, at least as a naturalist, I can totally see, speak, feel, and orient towards that.
Well, what I want to say, given what you just both said, and to bring back the thing again, right, is is biblical notions, and there's analog in the Greek tradition of being in the image of God. And the image of God was an image in the imaginal sense, right, that integrated the soul and the spirit. And notice that the value is ultimately not in us. We're valued precisely because we are the image of God, which is not anthropocentric. That's what I meant about how the religions did this, and they gave a proper functional image for relating the soul dimension to the spirit dimension.
And they've allowed the possibility with that framework of what I would call uniquely human anti-value, which they would call evil, which aligns with the same domain, which is that it's not just about you, man. Like, you're actually tapped into broader universal properties of the universe. And so that sense of the transpersonal, that the opposite of the human is not the animal, the opposite of the human is the demonic. And that's important to understand.
Yes, totally.
We don't regress to a state of being like monkeys. We regress to a state of being like demons, because we have the infinite in mind and can apply through idolatry the same energies we should be applying to the actual infinite and the real, to the pseudo image of it. And so that, as I think, one of the solutions to the climate crisis is, in fact, dealing with it as more apocalyptic, like actually dealing with it as if you're dealing with hospice, instead of trying to talk someone who's dying into being optimistic that it's all going to work out. And the only way to do that is to actually take religion seriously again. So the degree to which we're all uncomfortable individually dying, because we have no idea what that means, is the degree to which that the cultures will become incredibly dysfunctional as the global situation becomes more intense with the climate crisis. And so this is where I'd rather be, in a fundamentalist country with a bunch of people who believe in God than in a country when the shit hits the fan, then in a country has no idea what the meaning of human existence was ever about, or if their own life means anything, or if the entire civilization was for nothing, that we're all just matter in motion, etc. Like the epistemic and ethical nihilism sinks in. And so I think we actually need to not have the climate conversation be about how to fix it, but how to die well together, because that will give us the actual relationships necessary to fix it. If we keep relating to one another as if some of us are getting out and some of us aren't, which is how it's going now, right? Maybe the vaccinated get out, the unvaccinated don't, or something like that, right? But we're creating scapegoats of people who will not escape, and some people who will. And so that's the opposite of the way we need to think. There's no escape hatch. Every escape hatch goes in deeper. That's what the ensouled realize, that the transcendent don't. And so that's a deep concern I have, that in particular, the West is going to go insane through the absence of the kind of neo-perennialist, evolving, meta-normative framework.
It's Conrad's statement, Marlowe's statement about Kurtz. He was clear in his mind, but mad in his soul. That kind of madness. That's what you're talking about.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, because the scientific, that's clear in the mind. Like we see it coming. The scientists aren't, right? But we're mad in our soul. We don't know how to absorb the truth that we've.
Heart of darkness. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. I think we should draw close here, because not because I think we've come to like a moment of repose, but just we're now treading into some deeper waters. I think we should explore again, maybe next time, maybe we can do one more of these, together, or maybe more, but at least one more, because I'd like to talk more about this. We talked a little bit about evil. I think we should maybe talk a little bit more about that as a developmental possibility. There's something related to evil, but not the same as evil. And I'm sorry, I'm invoking the biblical tradition because it's the one, it's the imaginary that seems most pertinent right now, which is sin, which is some kind of defect in being the image of God. It's a fallenness, right? And of course, I understand that mythologically, and those aren't exactly the same thing, right? Right. And trying to work out what that means about ensoulment and spirit and development, because this again, and I really like the way we're getting into the depths of the normative question and the functional phenomenology and the phenomenological functionality at the core, because I think we're really now hitting at the depths of, well, for lack of a better term, adult development. I think these are the central questions by which we can appropriately and normatively, not just explanatorily, we can appropriately talk about adult development, such that we could make justifiable criticisms about like why that adult is not properly developed. And Zach, you were already doing that a bit with the word mature, but and I don't mean this as an insult, I mean this as a compliment, but you're deepening that word beyond how it's normally used.
Absolutely.
You really are. There's a lot that's being laid into that word that needs to be unpacked in connection to the conversation
I agree.
we just made.
Yeah, that sounds great for a future.
Yeah. No, I think that's
These are conversations that psychologists aren't supposed to have. These conversations. These are like philosophical religious conversations, guys.
Okay, so before I end, I always like to, I've set a problematic for next time, and give both of you gentlemen any final summative or cumulative words you want to give, or?
No, I mean, I really enjoyed it. I think that we've honed in. I think you're right, John. We honed deeper into this core crux of the issue, which I think this whole issue about what are we trying to transform and what's the normative dimension in relationship to this is very, very profound. What are the elements? What is the normative dimension? What affords a justification across a wide variety of different domains? It's something that our field psychology doesn't struggle with anywhere near the depth. And I really do like, I feel that there's at least potential to deepen the orientation toward that, if not resolve it, but deepen the orientation toward it.
Yeah, I kind of said my bit there with the joke about the psychologist, but this is just such a blast, and these waters are very deep, and so it's been gratifying. It's been very gratifying to get this deep. So thank you, guys.
Well,
All right.
thank you both, gentlemen, and I look forward to our next time together.
Great.